everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live broadcast, a replay of an event that was held last November. Today, we're going to be talking about the not-so-curious linkage between upward mobility, mentorship, and safety. Back in November, we had the entire UPRT Safety Summit, and this presenter was one of several. We have been replaying these events because by breaking them up, it allows us to devote a little bit more time to questions and answers, which is really often some of the most compelling parts, is having that discussion and having you in the audience be able to participate. So we hope that those of you that are watching will let us know where it is that you're joining us from. And as we're having our conversation, please try and think of some things that you might like to ask our guest, Paul Ratte, about when we get done. And I'm going to have Paul join us right now. Good morning, Paul.
Morning, Randy. Nice to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I'm not going to do a lengthy introduction because that was done in the original event by our CEO, Paul Ransbury, who did a wonderful job. Reading your biography, I was a little bit jealous that BJ got to do it instead of me because you had such a wonderful background to talk about what this presentation is about, your overall view of safety. For our viewers, the presentation recording that we're going to run now is going to run for about 24 minutes, and then we'll come back to Paul and myself to ask some of your questions. So again, go ahead and let us know where you might be watching from, and we'll look forward to talking everybody on the flip side. Okay, Paul?
Sounds good.
It is my honor to introduce Paul Ratte with the United States Aircraft Insurance Group, or well known as USAIG. At USAIG, Paul holds the position of Director of Aviation Safety Programs, and the topic of his presentation today is the not-so-curious linkage between upward mobility, mentorship, and safety. Let me talk about Paul and his background. He's one of the many giants we have speaking at today's event. He has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and an MBA from Spring Hill College. Prior to joining USAIG, Paul had a long, distinguished career in the U.S. Coast Guard as an aviator. His flying experience spans the Atlantic, Alaska, Gulf of Mexico, and Great Lakes regions, and he spent 9 years as a flight examiner. As the operations director of the then largest Coast Guard air station in Clearwater, Florida, he oversaw fixed-wing and rotary-wing operations across southeastern United States and the Caribbean Basin. At the rank of Captain 06, he was the commander of the U.S. Coast Guard's air stations in both Traverse City, Michigan, and Atlantic City, New Jersey. Paul has over 5,000 hours of helicopter flight time and has been twice awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for life-saving rescues in severe Alaskan conditions. He is a Commodore's List graduate of U.S. Naval Flight Training, and he holds FAA rotorcraft and single-engine airplane commercial pilot license with instrument ratings. As USAIG's Director of Aviation Safety Program, Paul facilitates relationships between providers of safety services and policyholders. He coordinates the production of USAIG's Premium on Safety quarterly newsletter and synthesizes policyholder concepts into key messaging to reinforce workplace safety. He participates as a valued participant in aviation safety forums across the USA and is a trusted safety expert and resource to both policyholders and USAIG personnel alike. I personally known Paul for many years, largely working together on the MBAA Safety Committee. I can tell you he has a great sense of humor, and he's most definitely a trusted advisor to a wide diversity of aviation and safety organizations and initiatives around the world. Paul's a great leader, a champion of aviation safety, and I consider him a personal friend. Paul, with all of that, over to you, sir.
Hey, thanks for inviting me to be part of the summit this year. I'm really honored to be presenting. Let's get on with it and jump right in. So, have you ever gone back and reread a book you've read previously and you had a noticeably different experience the second time around? New subplots are showing up, details emerge that you totally missed the first time around. I recently did that with an accident report. And I know what you're probably thinking. This guy reads accident reports. He's a safety geek, right? Well, maybe guilty as charged. But, if you've never read through an accident report yourself, you should, because it'll give you a whole new perspective on the way accident chains form and develop. I'm also pretty sure it'll steal your determination to never, ever be the subject of one of these investigations. Every story is audience sensitive to a degree, right? What we notice most is derived from where we've been. And for many of us, where we've been has been in a highly technical and procedurally based aviation career path, where the offices are the size of elevators, except they have 2 chairs and a whole lot more buttons. That background can bias us into the technical and procedural lanes and force us to miss things on the periphery. Are procedural and technical issues ever the whole story in an accident? It stands to reason that there are nuances everywhere in an accident chain. So the accident I was looking at was this one. On a May afternoon in 2017, a Lear 35 leaves Philadelphia International Airport on a repositioning flight. The weather was good that day, except for some strong and gusty winds. 18 gust 32 at the airport they were headed to, low-level wind shear alerts being reported by landing traffic in the area. 28 minutes after they take off from Philadelphia, the pilots lose control of their aircraft while on approach to Teterboro, New Jersey. You've probably heard about this flight for at least one of 2 reasons. First, accidents this severe are rare in jet aviation these days, and that's a good thing. But when something this severe happens, the industry takes notice and word gets around fast, and it certainly did in this case. The other reason is that the errors of judgment and piloting practice and unprofessional behavior seemed so egregious, so blatant in this crew, that it was inevitably going to become a widely discussed case study in aviation safety circles. And it's certainly been there for that. You've potentially seen a postmortem on this mishap maybe more than once. And if you have, you'll recall that the jet's 2 pilots, the only occupants aboard, it was a repositioning flight, were killed when their aircraft stalled at very low altitude on approach and crashed into a parking lot about a half mile from the runway. You might think, since this is an upset prevention and recovery training summit, that my central point is going to revolve around the upset or the precursors that the pilots missed and didn't resolve. Well, that's where my analytical bias took me at first too on this mishap. But today, let's do something different. Let's focus on some organizational cultural issues instead. So a bit about my background. I served in the United States Coast Guard for 26 years. And a blessing and curse of serving in the military, as many of you probably know, is that they give you 2 or 3 years to acclimate into one culture, and then they rip you out of it and summarily drop you into another culture every few years and force you to reacclimate. It's awesome and frustrating all at the same time. But, one thing it did for me anyway, and it probably does for many, is it makes you a bit of a student of organizational culture. You see the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you take some things away from that as you go. Well, one of my units that I served at really had it right on culture, in my opinion. It just clicked better than all the rest. And hindsight has convinced me that a primary reason is that they found a 6th year rooted in a specific aspect of mentorship. I'm going to let you know which one it was and more about that in a bit. So 15 years before that incident's happening at Teterboro, I'm saluting the Admiral, shaking my predecessor's hand, and I'm reaching a long-term personal goal of attaining command of a U.S. Coast Guard air station. I'd moved there fresh from being the operations director at then the Coast Guard's largest air station in Florida. And before that, I was deputy operations at a large air station in Alaska. So I'd been directing traffic at a couple of very busy aviation intersections for years on end. I felt brimming with confidence. I'd learned some things, I'd seen some things, and I was poised to come teach my new unit a thing or two about how to operate efficiently and effectively. So imagine my surprise 4 or 5 weeks in when I'm pulling my hair out, flustered and frustrated, and thinking, if only these damn people issues would let up, if they just get off my desk, I'd have time to work on the things I really feel like I came here to accomplish. Well, newsflash to me at the time, the organization I'd been put in charge of already had an extremely competent and fantastic staff. And what they didn't need was somebody up in the commander's office trying to do their jobs or micromanage them. What it could benefit from was somebody taking a wide view of this culture at the place, kind of gauging what was working and what wasn't, and trying to do his or her best to steer it into better and stronger modes. So that became my mission. And thinking deeper about the frustrations I felt early on, it kind of illuminated for me that I'd been underappreciating something that I now see as a fundamental truth. If you want a thriving and a positive culture in any organization, people, actual human issues, need to be a constant rather than an occasional focus. And that can be a hard thing for those of us that grew up in that technical, analytical, procedural aviation career path. Pivoting to the more subjective people focus, well, that might require taking a big hike outside your comfort zone. But someone, and usually someone's plural, has to do it if a positive culture is going to take hold and thrive, even on a small team. Too many managers today at all levels fall prey to thinking the people issues are somebody else's job. It's HR's job. As long as we provide direction and resources and a safe working environment, we've met our mandate. Well, maybe you have legally or not. I'm not sure about that, but I can tell you, you haven't met it if you want a thriving culture. So years prior, there had been a political campaign, I think, that used "It's the economy, stupid" as a slogan to stay on task and prevent them from drifting off message. Well, I wrote a note that said, "It's the people," and I slid it under the glass on my desk where I'd keep seeing it, and it actually helped me. And it leads me to my key point number 1 of 4 today for today's talk. For a positive culture to develop and thrive, people need to be a constant rather than an occasional focus. You know, in every organization I've seen with a positive culture, I can identify people at various levels that get this. And in almost every case where the culture is struggling, you'll find gaps where either nobody has this view, or more commonly, people issues are treated as a part-time secondary concern that we'll get to after we get through the important stuff. That observation seems kind of profound to me when you think about it. As it turns out, people really like having opportunities to advance. More knowledge, better pay, greater responsibility, higher qualifications. You know, this works for millennials and Gen Zers too. Everybody feels this way. And I'll just group those things together and call it upward mobility. Everybody likes that. And it shouldn't really come as a surprise because we can all relate, right? When we can see the next rung on the ladder and we can picture ourselves getting there and leveling up, we're motivated. Of course, when we don't have that, stagnation sets in, and it leads to what I abbreviate as CAD: complacency, apathy, and detachment. You know, complacency, being dangerously oversatisfied and resistant to do anything or expend any effort to change it. Apathy, ceasing to care. I don't care how good this landing is. I don't even care if it's safe. I don't care what that customer thinks when we part ways. I don't care what my supervisor thinks of my performance. Apathy. And finally, detachment, severing communications. I'm going to stop giving my opinion to the organization, and I'm going to stop listening to what the organization's saying and telling me. You know, you'll find these 3 enablers lurking around accident scenes, and it's not a coincidence that they're there if you think about it. Ideally, you'd like to have immunity from outbreaks of these things on your team. But as any good epidemiologist will tell you, if you haven't generated immunity, you better at least have some good defenses. So how do you go about getting good defenses? Well, one of the surest ways is to start asking, what are people here striving for? What professional development opportunities does each one of them have? Are they fair? Are they well communicated? What additional opportunities or motivating influences can the organization possibly provide? It takes considerable effort and thought, and get this, actually asking the people what they'd value to feel the professional development process that can offer something for everyone. But something for everyone is your goal. And since that's the case, it needs to proliferate because one leader at the top of a large organization can't possibly reach everyone. There's a span of control issue, right? Probably 3 to 5 people. This whole notion of a professional development regime setting up as a norm in your organization has to proliferate down and become a manageable practice at all levels to fit that span of control. The good news is that the external environment will help you. You're not going it alone here. You know, seconds in command will typically seek naturally to want to do the things to upgrade the pilots in command. Some others will seek increased responsibilities and certifications like certified aviation manager, or on the maintenance side, inspection authorizations and many other professional pursuits. But the external environment won't naturally provide enough for the right kind of pursuits necessarily that fit in your organization. You need to put in some effort as a leader to find the relevant good fits between your organization's needs and the personal needs of everyone in your immediate circle. It's hard, but I contend that that effort's worth it, because if any members of your team start sensing, hey, I'm stuck and my chances of upward mobility are gone here, some bad things are going to start happening in your culture. None of them are good at all. One is that CAD sets in, and apathy in particular grows quickly. And it goes well beyond quiet quitting. People who are fundamentally achievers, those people that you actually want to keep, well, they'll actually quit. They'll seek a different employer. An outfit that maintains a professional development focus is going to attract and retain the best employees. One that doesn't, you get it. With today's aviation workforce outlook, where do you want to be? Where can you afford to be? What might be the safety costs of not attracting the caliber of employees that you want and need to do the things you want to do? In the case of our Lear crew on their way to Teterboro, both of those pilots had a history of difficulty passing their check flights and requiring holdovers for supplemental sim work. Now, there are provisions for that, and that occasionally happens, and it's corrective. The corrective policies in place with the training regimes are helpful. But when you pair that background with these pilots with what you know about their performance on this flight, you begin to kind of develop a valid question in your mind on whether this operator was able to, even before the accident, attract the talent it needed to do the kinds of things it was doing? And if it wasn't able to attract talent from external, was it taking sensible steps internally to support growing the people that it had? To that end, there was this progressive qualification policy for seconds in command at the company. The second in commands would advance through 5 levels as they gain more and more experience. Sounds reasonable so far in light of what we've been discussing. The SIC on this aircraft, who had been hired a little over 8 months prior, was still designated level 0, which by company policy means he was only permitted to be the pilot monitoring, never permitted to be the pilot flying, except when he was paired with a company check airman. Well, things begin to unravel because the operator was short-staffed, had been for a long time. And due to these staffing challenges, the operator only had line captains in the Lear 35, hadn't had a check airman in type for the SIC's entire 8-month term of employment. That's a pretty bleak outlook for that SIC, don't you think? Never able to legally touch the controls in flight. No hope of upgrading through the 5 levels that are in the company's policy manual. And it's a significant safety issue too, right? Aren't seconds in command supposed to be able to take over and be proficient enough to do that if it's required of them? It's probably not surprising then, and I missed this the first time through the mishap report, that the SIC had secured alternative employment and in fact was scheduled by his new employer to report for sim training in a different aircraft just a week after this accident. But here's another thing. He hadn't told management that he was leaving a week prior. That's evidence of detachment, isn't it? And as we remember, that's an accident enabler. Let's also not let the rhino in the cockpit off the hook either here. We have to talk about this because guess what? The second in command was flying this leg. He was at the controls basically until just seconds before impact. The captain let the SIC fly in violation of company policy. And when investigators talked to the other SIC 0 in the company at the time, he said other PICs let him do it too. It was one of those normalized deviations where the captains were faced with an unsavory choice. They either had to robotically defend a policy that's clearly unworkable or be a get-along, go-along guy who bent the rules. They were left to sort it out for themselves. The company was taking no action on what was clearly an obvious gap in organizational policy and left the captains to deal with the ambiguity on their own. In that case, I think cultural decline is evident. There's complacency and detachment evident in the captains. Apathy can't be far behind. Remember, these things are accident enablers, right? Cultural decline doesn't have to be this evident to be present. Ask yourself, have you looked purposely at the team of people in your span of influence for any signs that them lacks upward mobility? I suspect there are pockets of this in just about every organization, and my key point number 2 is finding and resolving cases where people on your team lack upward mobility. It's vital to avoiding cultural decline in your organization. But as we settle on that, let's avoid a few common traps that some outfits fall into, particularly for pilots. One is not thinking enough or at all about what happens with their captains. It takes many steps and lots of personal effort to earn a captain designation. Let's remember that. And then you get there. And then there's this initial honeymoon phase. And then the captains can then find themselves wandering around in this professional development desert. It's a mistake to put all the organization's effort into supporting pilots until they reach captain and then miss the need to keep professional growth opportunities in place for the captains thereafter. Take a captain, add 1 part professional stagnation, add 1 part policy ambiguity that the company isn't dealing with, add the protein of your choice, and you've got yourself an unhealthy procedural noncompliance salad. That's my contention, and I think that happened just short of Teterboro that day. And there are lots of professional development opportunities if you look into them. Leadership courses, certifications, safety manager training. And, the obvious one here, upset prevention and recovery training, presents a fantastic example. A bit after attaining captaincy, that can be an ideal time in a career path for a refresher on aerodynamics and a refinement in manual flying skills, in addition to the basics that upset prevention and recovery training provides. Those boxes all get checked big time with UPRT. It's also a great way to demonstrate that the organization is invested and focused specifically on developing and advancing its captains. And a bonus for you, it strengthens your defenses against an upset occurring on every future flight that captain commands. Another flood the organizations can fall into is that captains don't need professional development because they get plenty of satisfaction sharing their wisdom with others and bringing them up. Well, let's all admit that being able to do something good yourself does not automatically make you suited to teach it to others. Not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody needs to be an instructor. Hear that. Not every pilot is bound to be an instructor. When you have pilots that are so inclined and possess the characteristics of a good instructor, assign them, help them along the way in professional development along that path. But understand that that path isn't for everybody, and that's my key point here. Professional development can and should take different vectors for different people in your organization. Not everybody's going to be an instructor. Back in the Lear, we had a captain about 6,900 hours total who hadn't had any documented leadership or instructional training that the investigation turned up. And while not doing it very constructively at times, the captain devoted much of the 28-minute flight to coaching and instructing his SIC through basic flying skills. We know this because the NTSB kind of marked it out as something they learned from the voice recorder. In fact, the NTSB cites the captain's own distraction due to his coaching efforts as contributing to the loss of situational awareness that enabled the accident. So reading the report the first time, I saw the captain as this incredibly poor example setter. No weather check, unprofessional cockpit, foul language in the cockpit, press-on-itis, just continuing to press deeper and deeper into this situation as more and more confusion about where they were and what they were doing seemed to mount up. Those are horrible examples. And you know, as you put those things together, it paints the captain as someone who's apathetic and seemingly uncommitted to a positive culture. But on the other side, he apparently felt a personal duty to take on some personal risk, bend the company rules, and give this SIC a chance to fly. And not only that, he spent the time investing in him and trying to improve the SIC as a pilot, which leads me to key point number 3. If you ignore professional development as an organizational priority, you cede control. Potentially unsafe or unsound workarounds are going to sprout up on their own in your organization. They may not reinforce things that you feel are important or that are right for the organization. Remember, this summit is about staying in control. It's necessary to do that in the aircraft. It's also necessary to do that at the organizational level too. A positive culture, like we said, doesn't need everyone to be instructors, but a related concept that applies much more broadly is mentorship, which in my view acts as a prerequisite to instructorship. Now, a mentorship program can be a formal thing where less experienced persons are specifically paired with more experienced employees. That works good if you have all those things in your organization. If you don't, NBA has a great process whereby experienced people in your organization can become mentors to people outside, or less experienced people in your organization can get mentors from the outside. I'll leave it to you to check into that if that's of interest. But let's focus on just one simple thing. There's a tremendous amount of informal mentorship present in the very simple examples we set and we tolerate every single day. You know, not to freak you out or anything, but people actually watch what you do. Mentorship in its most basic form is being a good example for someone else. There's some evidence, apparently, that I'm not the first one to realize this. Think about the Lear captain. He was attempting to instruct without mentoring. Does that ever work? If you aren't showing the way, you won't be credible teaching the way. And that gets me to that unit that I was most proud of and I thought really had it going on right. It was this one up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts that I served at for 3 years. You know, the thing that set this apart was that there was a clear recognition and atmosphere of respect in everyone there for the raw power of the personal example. It was as if everyone felt a sense of kind of legacy, adding gravity to their decisions and their actions. It wasn't complex. It wasn't stuffy. We didn't even talk about it. It just became the natural order. You took your cues from people who kept working to set good examples for you, and you in turn were kind of compelled to pay it forward and keep setting good examples as you went further. As things would develop here, there wouldn't be procedural noncompliance because there was an open dialogue. People were not detached. They were communicating and setting all kinds of good examples, basically in every quadrant. Morale was through the roof at this place. And the other thing that I remember about it is that those serving there at the time went on to career success at considerably higher rates than our peers who were serving elsewhere. That's saying something about the power of a personal example, you know. And as I think about how it applies to the Lear case, you know, if we were at that unit going into some of the most complex airspace and one of the most hectic ATC environments anywhere, as this crew was, we'd have studied the route. We'd have identified the gotchas. We'd have been pre-briefed and ready. Why? Because legacy is watching. And that kind of brings me to my 4th point, which is legacy is always watching, okay? Consistently striving to be the best example of what you're trained and expected to do is some of the most powerful mentoring that you can access. And it's available to everyone, and it's contagious. You know, it's not hard to imagine things you could have done differently on that May afternoon to prevent that Lear 35. If you had been sitting in the cockpit, if you had been in the flight briefing room getting ready for the flight, you could have checked the weather, you could have made some adjustments to approach speeds, all kinds of things. But my challenge to you is not that, because that's the easy part for those of us that have been in this aviation career path. My challenge to you is to go beyond that and think about the things you could have done had you been in this organization weeks, months, or years before that day to interrupt this accident chain back when it started being built. I submit there are things that you likely can apply, and some or all of them may even apply in your own organization now as defenses against cultural decline. I hope your organization can use the ideas I've raised today to strengthen its safety culture and boost your immunity to the threats that CAD represents. You're attending a summit focused on advancing safety through UPRT. That's one of the best professional development opportunities available to pilots today. So you're on the right track. And remember, within your organization, stay consistently focused on people issues. Ask questions and resolve cases where people are stagnating professionally. Put in the effort and find opportunities for everyone that sync with your organization's needs specifically. And finally, put the free power of the person example to use in your organizational culture. It'll do great things for you, and the cost is right. It's free. Thanks for listening today. Stay well, fly smart, and get home safe each and every time. Have a good day.
There we go. Now we're unmuted. Well, thank you very much for that, Paul. As we've been watching this, we have viewers from 4 different continents with us, and, they can all benefit from that holistic viewpoint that you just shared of good and bad examples. And, you and I were talking a little bit before today's broadcast about changes from when we initially ran this in November. And one of the things that has continued to change is the churn in the industry and the hiring and the need for pilots. And, the message of messaging is only becoming more important because of all of that.
Sure. Yeah, I think the benefit of being an employer of choice today just keeps rising. And the cost of not being that is also rising. With kind of a narrow labor pool, the ability to attract the best and the brightest and to retain them is incredibly important. So I think the notion of a professional development regime being part of your organization is an incredibly powerful defense against those kind of cultural decline items setting in. It's kind of an early step you can take before, hopefully, to head it off from getting to the point where people are starting to experience some of those things we talked about in the presentation, the complacency and the apathy setting in where people are ready to leave. You want the high performers not even thinking about wanting to leave at this point, and you want them telling other high performers outside your organization, this is a great place to work. And I think that's really the crux of it. It can help in that regard.
Yeah, I think we were talking about, how your presentation stood out a little bit different. It's a little less nuts and bolts than some of the other presentations that we had during the 2022 UPRT Safety Summit, because it was a little bit more holistic. And I think that the aspect of UPRT that you are pointing to is certainly it is knowledge and skills based, and it contributes that. But you were really addressing the messaging component of what it transmits and tells people. If an organization is willing to invest, as USAIG has with their programs supporting UPRT, it kind of communicates the importance to the whole organization that you're trying to achieve excellence rather than just by ticking boxes and getting by the minimum regulatory standards.
Right. I think let's face it, if your pilot cadre is not ready to address an upset, then you have an open threat on your flight organization. So that's a threat you'd want to be closing by applying some training and getting your pilot cadre more adept and ready to deal with an upset. So that's the nuts and bolts aspect of it. But by the same token, my thought process, kind of like you said, went slightly wider. And my sense was that UPRT is an ideal avenue for professional development for pilots. I almost wish that weren't true. I wish we were on the other side of the mountain and that UPRT was just a baked-in element of virtually every pilot's repertoire of skills and proficiencies. But it's not quite there yet, right, in 2023. So at this point, if your flight organization has that open threat vector sitting there, and your pilots are not ready to address an upset training, you want to close that issue. The other thing is that if you need professional development opportunities to kind of burnish that reputation of an organization that supports its people and supports their upward mobility, upset prevention training is an ideal avenue of that today. The organization can literally look for ways to send their pilots through and set up a recurrency in that regard. And you're really, in my mind, you're achieving two aims. You're closing that threat vector of the upset causing an accident in your organization because it's not properly either diagnosed before it occurs and prevented, or not recovered from if it actually manifests. You're also heading off a sense of stagnation and upward mobility in your organization, and therefore you're stealing your defenses against those other kind of softer, more humanistic kind of effects in your culture from setting in.
So, Paul, we've got a great question from Frank Raymond that I'm going to post here. He says, can you speculate on how organizational culture may be a factor in the recent increase of high visibility runway incursions? Like your perspective, if you have any thoughts about, those items that are showing up in the regular press with somewhat alarming regularity lately.
Yeah, that's a very interesting dynamic, because it I'll be frank, it made me wonder if they were always happening and suddenly we're hearing a lot more about them all at once. I mean, we learned that there are some high altitude balloons flying over the continental United States at all times too, and all of a sudden there was a flurry of activity, and we learned about a lot of them all at once. So I wondered if this was kind of a similar dynamic where there were some close incursions that really weren't breaking the news cycle, and all of a sudden they got in there. But in terms of it seems like the human factors aspect of me wants to pin it on distraction, wants to say that somehow the crews that are having these incidences are so overworked or so deep into their capacity levels, doing the business that they're doing, that they don't have the excess capacity to sense the mistake that's occurring and to trap the error in a more timely fashion. Because we know an error trapped is almost as good as kind of an error never made. So I would think that there's a lot of people that were about to press beyond a hold short line and then caught themselves because they had enough capacity to take that last breath and look around and go, hey, wait a second, this doesn't feel right. It doesn't sound right. Are we cleared? And those kind of things. It feels like a distraction and capacity issue to me in the pilots. And exactly how that's come on, I'm not sure. But clearly, if there's a staffing pressure that's going on out there, then that's forcing more out of the people that are doing the job, and that would kind of feed into a notion of the folks that are doing the job are pressing into their capacity limits to stay focused and stay on top of all the variables.
Yeah, and I suspect that Frank's asking that question is because we don't know, and what our concern is it the tip of the iceberg with staffing issues and newer pilots in the cockpit. Our good friend Michael Ott, a valuable contributor to the NBAA Safety Committee, has this good question. He says, can you give some examples of ways to invest in your people when your company is so busy that they are already away from home as much as they are, and their families can stand? And I know from, I guess I'll try this one first and see if you have any thoughts on it, Paul, is that we know that is a big obstacle for people that we talk to at APS that say, we really understand the need and we would like to do that. Now, we are fortunate here at the Mesa Gateway Airport. I'm next to a Embraer service center, a Textron service center. We have a Gulfstream service center that's under construction and actually has temporary facilities on site. And so one of the things, Mike, that we have seen is there's no better time than when you have an aircraft in maintenance. If you're going to have a period, and obviously aircraft have to go regularly for that. And if you can use that downtime from a maintenance standpoint to try and schedule around, obviously they're going to have to travel to be able to get that training, but we hope that they feel that it's worth the investment of time. Do you have any thoughts on that, Paul?
I like the question. I think it's rooted in reality. But I guess where my head went was right back to that old movie 12 O'Clock High, right? Where we're pushing for the maximum effort out of the humans. At some point, you reach the point where you can't do it all, where there's going to be a breakdown in the system. So if your organization is stretched so thin that people are literally away as much as they can stand, then coming with that dynamic, I think is a real risk of cultural decline over time, because we're operating at capacity. Humans don't like to go to maximum effort and stay there. You want them not living at maximum effort, so that when they need the extra thrust, they can go there short term and get through the crisis or get through the particular task that needs to be flown that weekend. But after that, there needs to be a recovery period. The other thought I would have, Mike, would be that it's like that little nagging task around the house that you just keep wanting to get to, and you see it at odd times when you just can't get to it. But then, you don't think of it when you might have an extra 5 minutes to address it, and it just lingers. I think the way to approach it is to make a plan, not a this week plan, but a long-term plan. Sit down and have a professional development plan with literally everybody in your span of control, and make it a 6 month, a year, or a 2-year plan, and then check in. And if we didn't make any progress this month, because man, what a month it's been, that's okay. But if we get to 3 or 6 months in and we're still not making any progress, it's telling you something about the tempo of your organization and the risk you're bearing of cultural decline from not taking care of the humans, not providing the upward mobility or the time with their families that they need to kind of be well balanced and not come up against these capacity distraction type dynamics that can cause the mishaps Frank was asking about.
Well, Paul, in my book, you get points just for referencing 12 O'Clock High, and I would encourage anybody that hasn't seen it, if you want a primer on aviation leadership, it's a very good watch. Our good friend Jeff Wofford, former chairman of the NBAA Safety Committee, has as much an observation as anything else, and I'll point out that Jeff is going to be in the seat that Paul is in a month from now. I believe it's the 19th of May. We're going to be talking with Jeff and replaying his contribution to the 2022 UPRT Safety Summit. And he says loss control in flight remains one of the major causes of fatal accidents. The majority of these revolve around small operators, single pilot, owner operators situations. Our challenge is to get their attention. We have to find a way to get this out in front of these operations. Training providers and OEM buy-in is essential. And so this really speaks to, the cultural aspects of what your presentation is addressing, Paul, which is how do we change that culture? What levers do we have to try and get through to people? One of the things that we've seen at APS is that, and the NBAA Safety Committee found this out years ago, is that a lot of pilots don't appreciate the threat. It's not like a midair collision when you see other aircraft around. It's not like TCAS alerts. It's not like weather. It's not like automation mismanagement, which people see on a regular basis. And yet, one loss of control in flight can be people's last. So, do you have any thoughts? And this is perfect for you in your role as director of safety programs. It's got to be something that you put a lot of thought into, is how do we get people motivated in saving themselves, essentially.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and Jeff and I kind of fought that fight together for a while. On the safety committee, how do you reach the unreachable, so to speak? In particular, the single pilot, operator there. It's an interesting dynamic because they fall prey to the exact dynamic I was talking about in the flight department, where once you make captain, there's not a lot for you. The organization seems over-focused on growing their SICs into captains. And once they make captain, it's kind of like the spotlight shifts back to the next person coming up behind them. That was particularly how it was in the military. It was a bit of a captain mill. But it takes place out there in the real world too. With the single pilot operators, it sort of feels like, particularly if flying's not your primary business, we have quite a few of those people at USAIG because we maintain a small flight department with single engine piston aircraft, claims managers and underwriters kind of going out to take meetings and go to repair centers and things like that. And it's not their primary job, and so they're PIC qualified, and then what? They stay current. They do a flight review. They do an IPC, and then what? And there's not a natural necessarily a progression for them. They just feel like as long as I'm proficient at what I was doing yesterday, that's enough. And I think maybe there's an opportunity through some of these organizations, through some of the type clubs and things like that, to start providing kind of that way to earn higher acclaim or gain higher skill sets with the aircraft, where you can start kind of enticing some of these folks to take a next step and move beyond. I can fly my aircraft from A to B for business, and I do it periodically.
Well, I think Jeff is giving you a shout out here. Specifically, Paul, he says, additionally, insurance companies can be a great resource to get people pointed in the right direction. And that's exactly what you have done. And I'm going to make it even a little more personal than that, Paul, because I think that, the types of people that are on in the audience today are safety champions. And, we have a mission at APS of partnering with safety champions. It's something that we certainly have done with USAIG through you, because you saw the value and the benefits of the training that you contribute to. But I would reach out to all of the people that are watching. You have heard Paul's presentation on the contributions, not just of UPRT, but of investing in your people and the safety contributions of that. And I hope that those watching take those words to heart and really promote those as Jeff has, as Michael Ott has, as Paul Ratte has, as we try to here at APS. We stand by if we've got any more questions, but if not, I want to thank everybody for listening. Paul, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Just that I really appreciated the opportunity to be part of this. As we talked about before, I'm not a career jet pilot. I did really enjoy my opportunity to come out there with you guys and audit your course. I didn't do the flying portions, but even the academics are an incredible boost to your piloting confidence. And I would commend any aviator, be they kind of at the private level or even doing it professionally. If you haven't been invested in to get UPRT, it's worth your own investment to get that for yourself and to kind of get that level of confidence standing behind you. So while I would hope that the organizations listening took a cue to say, hey, this is something we need to look at. I called this thing the not so curious linkage. And the reason I kind of called it that is because once you peel it back a little bit, it's evident in the Teterboro mishap, right? It's evident that there was more to that than a pilot having a bad day, not checking the weather, being rather foul-mouthed in the cockpit, and being a poor coach, and basically doing an approach turn stall. There was more to that than just that. The sense of it is that you can look at a mishap like that and you go, oh, I know what that is. It's those technical things. And that was the extent of it. Nothing to learn here. But you start peeling it back a little bit more and you go, there's some different human dynamics that kind of fueled the culture in this organization, allowed some cultural decline to set in, and it probably contributed ultimately to the outcome that we saw happen there in the mishap. And once you lay it out and look at it, you're like, that's not surprising. It's not surprising if people are dead-ended in their upward mobility in an organization that they're just going to get antsy. They're going to want to leave. They're going to look for something else. They're going to invent routes on their own to achieve that, because it's human nature to want to develop and progress on some level. And so if the organization is not watching it, the wrong things are kind of going to happen. And that's why I kind of felt like, we tend to miss it. But once you actually look at it, it's pretty obvious what needs to be done. And I hope, just the thinking behind this kind of can get some sparks flying. And I think the solution's probably different in every setting in terms of what will solve the problem and what can be done with the staff you have and the dynamics and people being already stressed by being away from their families. There are certainly limits, but you overlook it at your peril is my point. And I hope you don't. And I hope everybody flies safe.
Well, we have three layers or three levels of mitigation: awareness, prevention, and recovery. Certainly events like this contribute to awareness. It's been 6 months since this aired the first time, and one of the things about that is that we go back and we can actually view your original message with a little bit of perspective. And there are two things that have occurred since last November. One is the FAA has announced its requirement for Part 5 SMF safety management systems for Part 135 and air tour operators, and certainly mitigating your threats. Loss of control in flight is a major contributor. But the second thing is that the FAA released an advisory circular called AC 120-123. It's on flight path management. And what's interesting about that, it's the culmination of an effort that started out in 1996 when we first started to realize that automation, as beneficial as it is, also posed a little bit of threat to manual flight operations, manual handling skills erosion. And in that, the FAA, as though we needed reminding, is talking about managing the flight path is the most important job that pilots have. And certainly UPRT is a great contributor in that and in manual flight operations proficiency. So, I think this is just going to be an ongoing subject. And I'm sure Jeff Wofford and I will have an opportunity to address it more in a month. We hope that some of you that are watching will join us at that time. Thank you very much for revisiting your presentation, Paul. We appreciate your perspectives and everybody for joining in. We hope that you'll see us again next month. So long, Paul.
Take care. Thanks.